Welcome to episode 64 of the High Tech Forum podcast. This time around, we're fortunate to have Anna Gomez with us as a guest. Anna is recently retired from Wiley-Rein, and after an extensive career in government service in both the public and private sectors. And we're going to talk about spectrum policy. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Thanks a lot for joining us. I really enjoyed your testimony at the Strengthening Our Nation's Communication Networks hearings in Energy and Commerce in May. And you dropped an idea that toward just kind of almost as an aside, probably that I'm very intrigued by, and I wanted to explore it, namely the need that the U.S. has to develop a national spectrum plan. Is this something you've been thinking about for a while, or is it just one of those kind of spur of the moment inspirations that you get when you're sitting in front of Congress?
No, it is something I've been thinking about for a while. The way that spectrum management has worked, particularly at NTIA, it usually starts with some type of a strategy that the president mandates to happen. And that gives the marching orders to the engineers at NTIA, and they move forward with the National Spectrum Plan or a National Spectrum Strategy. So my testimony was with regard to extending the FCC's or reauthorizing the FCC's auction authority. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about whether it should be an 18-month extension. And I argued that for practical reasons, we needed the 18-month extension. It needed to happen immediately, which would give time for NTIA and the FCC to work on a national spectrum strategy.
Well, guess what? Yesterday's Senate hearing on spectrum, they spent most of their time talking about whether the extension should be 18 months or longer. And it ended up being sort of a proxy where the people who are generally strongly in favor of unlicensed spectrum and alternate spectrum rollout modalities like so-called sharing, multi-tiered sharing like in CBRS, they wanted a longer extension because I guess the idea is there are strings attached to the auction authority, and they wanted those to be persistent. Whereas if it's 18 months, then with the new Congress can modify the conditions. But it seemed like everybody was in agreement that we need to extend the FCC's auction authority, which expires in September as things currently stand, and they actually have some work on the table that they're not going to be able to complete by September, right?
Yeah, the 2.5 gigahertz auction is starting. And the concern is that they won't be able to complete all of the work that needs to happen before licensing. And that's really going to set them back. I'm very sympathetic to those who would rather have spectrum clearly identified for a future auction so that you can tie the spectrum revenues to certain types of spending. Chairwoman Rosenworcel has been advocating for using it for NG 911, which is long overdue and would be really fantastic if that could happen. There's also a desire to use it for digital equity funding. And there's other uses out there. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm just really worried that they're running out of time.
Yeah, that came up yesterday as well. At least on the Twitter feed around the hearing, there was the public interest people, public knowledge, and they were very active in the Twitter feed, and they were talking about how, like, look, why don't we take the auction revenues and use them to fund public interest priorities? And there's been sort of a movement in that direction, I think, for several years now. It used to be, I guess initially they just went into the general treasury, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But then with FirstNet, Congress realized that, hey, you can actually use this money to support, projects that you want to do that are maybe challenging to the annual budgeting cycle that Congress goes through. I mean, because there are a lot of pitfalls in that, right? You may get your money and you may not. And if it's a long-term project, that's complicates the development of the project and the successful rollout. So yeah, it certainly is starting to make sense that we're not just going to be fighting about how to allocate the spectrum. We're going to be fighting about how to allocate the money.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
mean,
I'm not.
what they did with the funding in 2012 was they cascaded it, right? They said if there's enough funding for $7 billion for FirstNet, we'll give them that. If there's enough funding after that, we'll give $300 million for research and development. If there's enough funding after that, we'll give funding for 911. And I thought that was a good way to do it. And then whatever's left over, and I forget what other funding there was, whatever's left over after that goes to deficit reduction. And I thought that was a really good way to do it. And that's something they could probably do actually, even with the existing extension authority, is try to allocate at least some of it for uses like 911, digital equity, and then maybe look to future auctions for other spending purposes.
Well, and that can be a standalone bill in Congress, right? It doesn't have to be tied to the auction authority. Just if an auction is coming up, can't they just legislate like what to do with the money at the time?
I think so. I mean, some of it has to do with scoring. They always want it to be paid for. And it's hard to have a pay for if you don't have an auction to score. So it all comes down to that. Chairman Rosenworcel has some proposals for altering how the CBO scores these spectrum packages on the Hill, because they skew towards auctions. They auction spectrum. They don't take into account things like what you've already raised, like unlicensed, and certain of the CBRS. Some of CBRS is auction, some of it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been difficult to evaluate the economic impact of unlicensed spectrum. And we've heard a lot of people have tried, Microsoft in particular spent a lot of money trying to evaluate the economic impact of Wi-Fi, but it's kind of, I've always thought none of those analyses are really very convincing, because what's the but for side of that? If we didn't have Wi-Fi and we didn't have Bluetooth, then I guess in a lot of scenarios people would plug Ethernet cables into the conference room table that would be equipped, and so the fact that they're not having to plug in cables, I mean, how do you measure that? I mean, obviously makes a difference when people are maybe in public spaces, and certainly makes a difference in places. Well, I mean, like probably the average home nowadays has dozens of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth devices that you could, in principle, plug a lot of those things into a wire, but it'd be very difficult. I mean, I'm wearing Bluetooth headphones, and yeah, I could use wired headphones, but don't really want to. They work just fine. And then and wires aren't always. It's not always possible, not always practical. So I don't know. It obviously is a good thing. It's certainly great to have Wi-Fi, and yeah, I mean, as far as my professional career goes, the work I did on Wi-Fi in 1990, 91, 92 was one of the most fun things I ever did. Even though I was a skeptic, I didn't really think it was going to go anywhere. It seemed like it was just kind of very limited technology that we'd use in conference rooms, and that was about the extent of it. And boy, I was a bit wrong about that. But yeah, auction revenue is easy to score. I mean, it's just dollars and cents. And that actually came up. What's his name, Brazelon, talked about that yesterday, and they're trying to develop some economic models to score unlicensed spectrum like more fairly, and it's just a hard problem, but it's a great thing about economics. If you get 3 economists, you have at least 4 opinions, so you can. So back to the spectrum plan. I think it's kind of interesting that I'm not sure that any other nation has a national spectrum plan. Is there one?
Not sure. I think the UK
Uh-huh.
might have one, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, they probably have elements of one for sure. I know Singapore is very they've got a really excellent communications regulator that one of the things they've done is they'll go around and they're in a kind of a unique scenario because they have several hostile neighbors that are very close by. I mean, it's just you drive across a little bridge and you're in Malaysia, and Indonesia's close by. And Singapore is the only non-Muslim country in the area, so they're in a interesting political situation, and their neighboring countries aren't necessarily highly motivated to be very cooperative on the
Mm.
you know spectrum issues that arise at national borders, and pretty much all of Singapore's national border. So, but I don't think they have something that fully fleshes out, like identifies uses for bands and sets targets and and that sort of thing. So, but we are the first nation in the world to develop a national broadband plan in the iPhone era. I mean, I think the work that Blair Levin's group did in the first year of the Obama administration, I mean, reflected that. Is that lots of countries have done national broadband plans, but ours was the first one to identify the spectrum component of it, and they identified the spectrum crunch and set targets for the repurposing of government spectrum, and to alleviate those issues and sort of make the marketplace for mobile devices, which are just emerging then, obviously, to make that thrive. And so, in a sense, I mean, that was sort of like a national spectrum plan, version 0.1, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that fed into what became Obama's executive order, directing NTIA and the FCC, well, NTIA to work with the FCC, because he can't direct the FCC, to identify 500 megahertz of spectrum from federal and non-federal
Mm-hmm.
sources to be repurposed for commercial uses.
So where do we stand on that goal? Did we achieve that?
We did.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you exactly what the bands were off the top of my head, but it was both federal and non-federal spectrum that were identified and repurposed 500 megahertz.
Yeah. And I guess a big chunk of that would have been C-band.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we finally, I think, discovered the value of mid-band spectrum thanks to 5G.
Yes.
This It's kind of an aside, but seemed like the U.S. has been really slow in making mid-band spectrum available for licensed use in 5G. Compared to other countries, of course. In the EU and the UK, the prime spectrum identified for 5G is mid-band. It's like 3.2 to 3.8 gigahertz, something like that. Which turns out to be that was a pretty wise decision on their part, because those are from like 2 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz is the parts of the spectrum that the carriers find most beneficial for 5G. And we tried, but we have a lot of we have satellites and we have government use in that area, so it's a little bit more challenging for the U.S. to, because I mean, I guess our military allocation for spectrum is much greater than that in pretty much any other country, and it's hard to take assets away from the military. So yeah, it's been a more favorable environment, I think, in those markets, and Japan too, and in East Asia, Korea, Southeast Asia. More favorable market in some of the countries for 5G, but despite that, we're actually doing pretty well on the 5G rollout in the US, right?
Yeah, I think so. Always we could find some more mid-band spectrum, but 5G is currently being rolled out, and I expect it will continue to be.
Yeah. Well, and I guess T-Mobile happened to be in a good spot when they were able to merge with Sprint, because Sprint had been using that what was really considered to be kind of like not beachfront spectrum for a long time, that they happened to be able to get, from the schools, because it was just like nobody was using it. It turned out to be like pretty cool stuff for doing 5G. And so around 2.3 to up to the Wi-Fi stuff at 2.8, it's like that's really good. That's a good place to be for 5G. But I guess we made some early investment in the millimeter wave. So whenever that becomes a thing, which it probably will someday,
Mhm.
we're pretty well positioned to do that. And I guess a lot of the work on that was regulatory. Like if you want to build small cells,
Mhm.
you need a zoning architecture that allows you to get quick permits for low power small cells, and that's actually a controversy in some cities like the one I live in. Um, but yeah, we're going to develop. I think at yesterday's hearing, pretty much by the end of it, the one thing you could tell the senators are really looking for consensus,
Mhm.
and they kind of went through a couple of different iterations of to find things that they really all agreed on, because there really is a pretty decent spirit of at least attempted bipartisanship in the Senate these days. And were towards the end, they're pretty much all embracing or endorsing the idea of developing a national spectrum plan, and if for no other reason than just to make the auction authority questions easier to solve. So if we do that, how do we? I mean, as you say, it's not a completely unprecedented activity in the U.S. and on kind of maybe a little smaller scale. NTIA and executive branch are used to doing that. Would you envision this as something more comprehensive than the kind of little mini plans we've had in the past?
I do think so. I mean, I think it's getting harder and harder to find spectrum that can be fully reallocated for exclusive licensing, which makes it more complicated, but also means you have more opportunities over broader swaths of spectrum. So there's a few things. First of all, we're not just looking at low band spectrum anymore. And so now between mid and high band spectrum, it's important to try to see what the playing field is. It can be studied, because all of this is going to require study,
Mm-hmm.
understanding who the incumbents are. Can they be relocated, or can there be sharing? Under what circumstances? Who gets affected by it? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be a lot of studies that need to happen. Then the first thing you need to do is you need to identify the low hanging fruit that can be repurposed quickly. And I'm talking both federal and non-federal here. It's not just on NTIA to find federal spectrum. It's also on the FCC to figure out, okay, what could we do differently with what we have? Um, then you need to start looking more long term, because internationally, the process is very lengthy to
Mm-hmm.
identify spectrum, change the table of allocations, and so that
Well, and
really need to
develop
think
technologies to use it too. Like, yeah.
to exactly develop technologies. Harmonization is so important for so many reasons. So you need to have both a short-term plan and a long-term plan. And then I think, I don't know if you saw that the chairwoman and Alan Davidson signed the MOU, the NTIA
Mm-hmm.
FCC Memorandum of Understanding. And I
Yeah, it's
thought
kind of impossible to miss that. It's really a big deal. Yeah.
it's a big deal. And one of the things that I really liked about what they had in the MOU, the prior MOU basically said, we're going to coordinate. We've got 15 days to coordinate if we, if our spectrum decisions affect each other. And that was pretty much it. That was the entirety of it. In this case, they also talked about things like developing a common language. I'm paraphrasing.
Mm-hmm.
Developing a common framework, an engineering framework, making science-based decisions. And I think that's going to be so important because a lot of the controversies that we've been hearing about don't use a common understanding of an interference threshold, for example.
Yeah.
And so this spectrum strategy, I think it would be really good if they would identify a common, I'm going to call it language for use of, for want of a better word.
Analytical framework.
An analytical framework. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Even an engineering framework, so that their decisions can be based on some kind of a common methodology. And so that's something else I would love to see in the National Spectrum Plan. And then, of course, they need to think about what are the criteria they're going to use for identifying spectrum. And if they are going to go to more sharing, then how exactly is that going to happen? And that's where NTIA has a lot of thoughts on how it wants to do that. A lot of people really want exclusive spectrum, but it's just not going to be possible forever. So I think it's important to have that discussion also as part of this national spectrum strategy.
Well, there are lots of ways to do sharing, and I think actually it's kind of a coup of the folks that did the PCAST report to have co-opted the term sharing. Because, nobody buys a license for a swath of spectrum just to use, to talk to their coworkers. I mean, when AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile get licenses for spectrum, that's so that, hundreds of millions of customers can share the spectrum. And that's literally what they're doing. It's just, but it's sharing with a centralized coordinator. That can make the real-time decisions that you really have to be embedded in the network to make. And so the kind of sharing that like CBRS type things do, instead of licensed spectrum gets shared on a millisecond or microsecond by microsecond basis. This other kind of sharing is like on the order of hours and days. And you can do coordination on that basis, especially if say if it's military needs to use this band when they're doing exercises, and maybe they need to use it if we're being attacked from the sea, the way people don't do anymore. If you have that kind of information, then you can make decisions and you can kind of move people off of it you got some place to move them to for hours at a time, but it's just not really the same thing. I mean, certainly in terms of efficiency, I think one of the considerations is, say, FirstNet, I think, is a really good example of a kind of spectrum sharing that's really is both efficient and effective at doing what it wants to do. And you basically have spectrum that most of the time functions the same way a normal commercial mobile network does, or you have lots of users that are doing lots of things, and you have a coordinator, and you have different kinds of service plans, and et cetera. But when there's a situation that comes up where public safety needs to get access to that spectrum, they can use as much as they actually need, and they have first call to it. But that doesn't mean the network stops and only does public safety stuff. I mean, because networks always have idle time. I mean, the Wi-Fi doesn't work unless a network has idle time, because that's how it's okay for you to transmit, because nobody else is transmitting. You sense the network, it's idle. You have to do that for some period of time to convince yourself it's truly idle, and then you can go ahead and go for it. But yeah, idle time is always part of the equation, so it's a question of how you allocate it. But yeah, I guess I'm just saying I'm not completely convinced that the way the CBRS model for sharing spectrum is the best way to do it. I mean, it's fairly easily understandable, and it's got that going for it. And there certainly are a lot of people who, small carriers in particular, benefited because the kind of licenses, the ASA licenses, are inexpensive. They cover small areas, and they sort of conform to like a small network, like a WISP type business model, which is, it's important in a lot of rural areas that we're trying to get connected these days. But yeah,
Yeah, I
I was,
absolutely agree. CBRS is one model, but it's certainly not
mhm,
the only model. There's lots of
yeah.
different ways to share spectrum.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the intriguing things about CDMA, the technology that was it Qualcomm invented, what, 20, 30 years ago now? It was a way that multiple transmitters could use the same frequency in the same space at the same time and not interfere with each other because they did it with the coding. So, like, you have two transmitters and they're encoding their transmissions in different ways. And because the receivers are looking for the message that's coded in a particular way, it saw the other one. It didn't see the other one. It was just kind of like background noise. So to me, it's more of a technology problem
Mhm.
than a policy problem.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, that would be like my input to a national spectrum plan is that engineers need to be at the table when this is developed because the a lot of the work that has gone on in that area to date has either been done by lawyers or economists.
Mhm.
I guess on the Democratic side, you tend to have a lot of lawyers. On the Republican side, you have a lot of economists, and the engineers are just sitting back going, I mean, we realize you guys are trying, you're doing the best you can, but uh, they'd like to be involved, but yeah, engineers can be hard to work with. Um, so yeah, there's looking at the overall thing that all of the steps that we have to go through to get like a new communication standard like 5G or 6G uh, to get it created. It's almost a miracle that it ever happens. Well, going back to something that's real basic, like we couldn't have had anything like Wi-Fi without unlicensed spectrum, but it wasn't. The FCC had never issued spectrum without a license before. Before uh, they did were liberated part of the ISM band for Wi-Fi. And so it's a chicken and egg problem where the engineers are not going to invent a standard for unlicensed spectrum until you have unlicensed spectrum, but you're not going to get unlicensed spectrum until you've got an engineering uh, solution that depends on it. I guess the thing actually what saved Wi-Fi was infrared, so there was actually some activity going on with wireless local area networks that were based on infrared. There was a thing called PhotoLink that was an Apple Talk extension that had infrared transmitters and receivers, but it's really clunky. It had like a big central hub that was on the ceiling in an office, and on the cubicle wall you had a deal that was about this big
Mhm.
that pointed at it, and it was it was around like 1 megabit per second, but Apple Talk was only like 300 and something kilobits per second, so it kind of worked okay, and it was yeah, you didn't have wires, so that was good. But yeah, if you go back and look at the original 802.11 standard, it has a radio based physical layer and also has an infrared physical layer. And I think they finally took the infrared layer option out because nobody had ever done it. But so yeah, I was saying it's kind of a miracle that these things ever get done because there's so many moving parts that involve government, technology, development, and marketing, and of course, nothing really gets done without venture capital and technology.
Mhm.
But we figured out a way to do that for the most part, and I guess it's just maybe it's just this is just a matter of formalizing informal processes, and sometimes that can make them work faster because there are government players who were involved in the development of the 5G standard before it was complete. At the very beginning, when people started thinking about wanting to use millimeter wave spectrum, that's an idea that had to be accepted by regulators and
Mhm.
chip companies and handset developers and and the academics who are involved in standards development. Everybody had to kind of buy into that. But it's I guess in some respects, it's, just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And you want to have some confidence that your ideas are, the options in the standard are plausible. And you have two or three options, and, probably is a pretty good chance that people will be using some of it. And the wonderful thing about 5G is it allows you to use spectrum that's all over the place and bond it together and coordinate it. So I'm kind of babbling now, but so I think it is. This is a question of developing ideas about developing a process for doing something more efficiently that we're doing already in kind of an ad hoc manner. I mean, does that pretty much capture it?
I think that's exactly right. And I
Yeah.
think having buy-in by leadership is really important. And that's a lot of what, just from a managerial perspective, to have a plan, to know what you're working towards so that you don't get
Hmm.
distracted by a million different things, even though it happens. It's very, very helpful. I mean, that is something I should say, at least on the spectrum front. We talk about the need for improved coordination. Coordination actually works quite well 90% of the time. It's just when it doesn't work well, it works pretty spectacularly poorly. And really what you're managing towards is those difficult coordination exercises.
Hmm.
But so you're right, a lot of this is happening. It's just a question of support and organization.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. The coordination thing came up a lot at the hearing yesterday, and of course the most spectacular example of a coordination failure was the C-band FAA aviation rollout, where everything was more or less fine until the carriers are ready to turn on the new spectrum, and then all of a sudden, aviation. I mean, they didn't raise new issues at the last minute, but they raised issues that had been addressed, 3 years before, and the FCC thought they'd addressed them because the aviation industry stopped complaining, but then they got. I don't even think they got new information. It's just the looming deadline, made them all of a sudden take their concerns, more seriously. But the coordination failure there, I don't think was really between NTIA and FCC, because they were pretty well, reading from the same hymn book. I mean, they had done their work on it and had come to an agreement between the two agencies about what needed to be done and how to address the concerns. It's just that FAA didn't buy into uh, the fact that NTIA is supposed to be the leader in the kind of spectrum decisions that FAA makes, right?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that were very interesting in the new memorandum of understanding between NTIA and the FCC. Previously, the MOU had talked about potential for interference to license or authorized spectrum. So you're talking about direct interference between the same bands, basically. The MOU that they just signed talked about adjacencies and making sure they resolve interference concerns with adjacencies. They also talk about receivers. And then finally, they talk about NTIA helping to coordinate concerns about interference in non-federal spectrum where the mission of a federal agency is affected, which is exactly what happened with the FAA, even though there were some DoD issues, but it was the FAA that was concerned about non-federal spectrum users having interference. And of course it was the receivers, and it was not even adjacent spectrum. It was
as much as 400 megahertz away.
well away, but
Yeah.
still suffering from concerns. And this is where the mission of the FAA versus the mission of NTIA and the FCC. NTIA and the FCC, spectrum efficiency, ensuring no harmful interference. FAA is safety of life and property. And they are going to take the most conservative tack they possibly can to ensure that they meet their mission. And in this case, as you said, they took the most conservative tack. But the big mistake there was they should have started that conversation 5 years ago, in 2017, when the FCC issued its first NOI saying, hey, we're going to look at these bands. Maybe that's a little early. But as you mentioned, the aviation industry, they raised concerns early in the docket. And the FCC said, hey, we looked at the math and the science, and based on authorized uses, there should be no harmful interference. We find no harmful interference. Lo and behold, there's receiver issues that they did not take into account. So to me, it's very interesting that the MOU has expanded the instances in which they're going to coordinate to make sure that they don't have a repeat of the C-band situation, which was very unique and very difficult. And it's turning out to be fixable, and it could have been fixed years ago had folks actually sat down and thought about it.
Yeah, it's I guess to some extent it's kind of an inventory problem, right? And that everybody wants to have spectrum inventories, but an inventory of receivers that are extant in the world that have, especially when they're located in safety of life scenarios, that'd be kind of a cool thing to have, right? Because I'd be really surprised if the FAA or anybody else actually knows how many kind of altimeters, 1950s altimeters are in use today. I mean, and I think, isn't this the problem here is that when those radio altimeters were authorized, there was nobody else in the neighborhood. It was like, you're greenfield and you're just like going ping, ping, ping. How close is the ground? Ping, ping, ping. And there's nobody within, a gigahertz of where you're doing your little ping, ping, ping thing to get to interfere with you. So, what's the big deal? Like, why would you make it all super robust and do some great signal processing and have lots of analog and digital filters on it? I mean, it's like, if you're just like screaming into the void, I mean, a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it. No, it didn't make sound.
No, that's
exactly.
No, it's to say that's exactly right. And you're right. The FAA did not have an inventory of the altimeters at issue. They had to work with industry to get them, and there's still altimeters that they don't know about in helicopters and private airplanes and so on and so forth, which they are continuing to warn through notice to airmen and other FAA advisories about this issue. So hopefully they'll get it fixed. But yeah, it's a very complex problem that really, I thought, laid bare a lot of the issues that we have between receivers, use of new bands that were not expected to be used 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, some of these altimeters are quite ancient.
Yeah. I mean, I think they literally started doing the radio altimeters in like the 50s, maybe even before.
Wow.
And it's also it was complicated by the fact that you had a series of acting administrators at NTIA during a fairly critical part of this whole process. There was a, full complement at the FCC and a full complement at FAA. I mean, FAA had a confirmed administrator, but NTIA did. And I guess if you've been through congressional confirmation, you don't necessarily regard the person in the next agency as equally legitimate or something. Yeah, I don't know. It was a strange story, but certainly when the coordination breaks down, we read about it in all the newspapers and on TV. It's on TV, and uh, I mean, I contributed a story to Bloomberg Law on this thing, and I've seen coverage in places where you would never expect anything to happen. But I guess it's a question of everybody likes to be able to hop on a plane and go somewhere. And not have to worry about, there's so many things to worry about in air travel nowadays. And just like the plane crashing because of rogue 5G transmitter somewhere, that's like, just come on. Yeah, that's just too much. I don't even want to think about that. But yeah, coordination between the people, the agencies who've been tasked to coordinate works pretty well. Trouble is, and this is raised by actually some other guests on this podcast that Mary Brown brought this up. That yeah, I mean the FAA and FCC and NTIA all coordinate with each other, but the airline industry, they don't coordinate. They don't coordinate with NTIA or FAA. I mean, and they're the ones that have actual skin in the game. And the FAA is sort of trying to keep those planes from crashing, but the airline industry itself has its own set of issues, and they're typically not included in all of the. Well, I mean, that's why we have notice and comment and all the public rulemaking and all that. But it's maybe a limited limited role in terms of the coordination. That was there anything in the MOU about bringing stakeholders, non-government stakeholders, into the process? Well,
No.
that's something we can put in the National Spectrum Plan, right?
Mhm.
Formalize some better interaction between industry stakeholders and government
Yeah.
stakeholders.
I mean, I think if I was, and remember, I worked at both the FCC and NTIA, the FCC would say it's our job to represent commercial and state and local uses of spectrum, and NTIA is their job to represent federal uses of spectrum. So through their own processes, they should be getting the input from stakeholders, like you're saying, and then talking to each other. That I think that's what they would say.
Mm-hmm.
It's important for there to be cross discussions. I actually really like the fact that the FCC is going to be going to the CSNAC meetings and the NTIA is going to be going to the TAC meetings and starting to have those kinds of conversations as well. I think it always works better when the stakeholders get to know each other, because there's a lot of suspicion, distrust,
Oh
mistrust.
yeah. Well, that's one of the things I've learned about what keeps the internet working is there are we all hear about attacks on the internet and attacks and routing problems and meltdowns and all that, and pretty much all of those things are resolved by face-to-face interaction between people who know each other, because they go to there are like certain meetings that they all go to 2 or 3 times a year, and they sit down, have beers with each other, and so somebody sees some weird behavior going on at Yahoo, they know who to call, and a couple of people who know and trust each other, fix it. And it'd be kind of nice if we could if the same sort of thing happened with Spectrum. I guess the problem is we do have interference problems with Spectrum because interference is sort of inherent in one person's interference is another person's signal, and so it's inherent in the process of conveying information over the air, that there are going to be interactions between where transmissions are going to be received by parties that don't care to receive them. And the resolution of that is oftentimes, well, somebody has to make a little adjustment in their power level, or maybe change the orientation of a transmitting antenna, or change the orientation and the azimuth of a receiver, and it's stuff like that, or that makes the problem go away, and you come up with maybe a kind of a temporary fix, and then uh, schedule some meetings to come up with a more lasting solution. And if you can't really get it done, then you go to some outside, you go to the FCC or whatever to get some help with it. But it is it's all about coordination. And yeah, so I guess coordination is the new sharing.
Well, you can't really share without coordination. So
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the whole point of it, right?
what comes
And
first?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing, is that in so much of this stuff in wireless communication depends on the chicken and the egg both sort of popping into existence at the same time. I mean, it's kind of that's the magic of it. Oh, great. So, as a recent retiree, is there? Would you care? Like, let's switch gears a little bit. What are the things that you did? You had like a really great career as a telecom policy work as both the lawyer and working in NTIA, FCC, the Hill. Um, I mean, it's always been my opinion that of all the spectrum lawyers I ever met, you pretty much have the best understanding of the whole issue of the as the whole bunch. And so it's really going to be like your retirement's going to be kind of it's going to leave a void. So, but what are the things that you're the most proud of that you got to do or help with in over the course of your career?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for saying that. I do say, I do want to say that I advise people to try to do both NTIA and the FCC, especially if you're going to be a spectrum person, because it really is so helpful to understand the equities and processes of both sides. NTIA manages spectrum very differently than the FCC does. And that's a lot of what raises sort of the problems, because they share a lot of spectrum among different agencies. They do assignments on a channel basis. They tend not to do exclusive licenses, and certainly not nationwide, things like that. So in any event, long story short, I recommend people do that. What am I proud of? I'm very proud of FirstNet. That was something that Larry Strickling, who was the administrator of NTIA, kind of delegated to me to work with the vice president's office and in coming up with the concept and then implementation afterwards. And it easily could have failed spectacularly. But I think that we recruited the right people to come up with the way to make it work. And so very, very proud of that. It was a lot of work. It was not easy. It was very stressful, but I'm
Well,
happy.
it's a really, I mean, it's an amazing, groundbreaking example of how to build a government network the right way. I mean, it's just, yeah, wow. That's
Yeah.
yeah, it was really, really an amazing advance, and I think people will come to appreciate it even more and more in the
Yeah, and
future.
I've been doing public safety for a long time, so I understood public safety. And I learned a lot about public safety even more during FirstNet. So I was very proud of that. I'm proud, of course, of my work as deputy administrator of NTIA. And I also think a lot about my very junior days at the FCC. I was a legal counsel in the Common Carrier Bureau back in the
Oh,
day
all right. Yeah.
when we were implementing the act. And so I got a chance to work on universal service, unbundled network elements, section 2, all of the 251, all of the different rulemakings that we had to put together. I got to work on right at the very beginning. And that was just, it was a huge learning experience, but it was also something I felt very good about. And then finally, I would say I've testified a couple times now since leaving government. Both times I was asked to testify. It was a NTIA authorization, and then the one that you most recently mentioned, which was the House Energy and Commerce subcommittee. And I really liked testifying because I'm able to share my perspective exactly as you mentioned, which is sort of having been deputy administrator and acting administrator for some time, and at the FCC, and understanding how Spectrum works. Although, the first hearing was NTIA authorization, so I got to talk about it generally. And I really like to support the agency. I don't think NTIA gets the credit it deserves, considering everything it achieves with its tiny little staff and its tiny budget. So whatever I
yeah,
can,
you're definitely right about that. I mean, I think I kind of offended Carl Nebbia once when I said I'd never heard of NTIA before I started working in Washington.
yeah,
And, and he said, well, I'd never heard of ITIF, but, and I said, well, yeah, well, neither did I. So it's just not, if there was ever an agency that needed public relations, I mean, that's it. People it's just unknown out. I mean, everybody inside the Beltway that does telecom policy certainly
yes.
lives and breathes NTIA, but it's just not known by the general public. It's kind of an interesting history too. I mean, uh, going back, there's a little Whitehead and Scalia and Hatfield involved in the one of the origin agencies, right?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right. Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, the time it gets the most notice is either a very big spectrum coordination problem, or they get a lot of money for grants.
Hmm.
That's when everybody suddenly says, wait, tell us about NTIA. And all of a sudden I'm getting a
Yeah, yeah.
call.
Yeah, who
But
is it? Who is this? It's giving out all the broadband grants
yeah,
now. Yeah, what's that? Okay.
otherwise
Hmm.
they're underappreciated. And it's a very difficult job being the administrator of NTIA. One of the things I advocated for in my testimony is an elevation of the role. Because as you
Hmm.
mentioned, if you have an acting administrator, someone who's been confirmed by the Senate is not going to take a political appointee that as seriously as they should. And in trying to enter into negotiations, when you have a assistant secretary title and you're negotiating with the deputy of the Defense Department, it really requires some goodwill on the side of the Defense Department. And I have to say, when we were doing it, there was a lot of goodwill, but it's not always the case. It can be very difficult.
Hmm.
The instinct is to go to the Secretary of Commerce, but the Secretary
Yeah,
of Commerce
right.
is the manager of the spectrum. It's the head of NTIA. So I really think they should elevate that position to an undersecretary. I don't think it takes a lot. Congress could stick it in any legislation and just do it. And I think they should.
What do you think we should have like one person that oversees both FCC and NTIA?
It's not how it was set up.
Uh-huh.
It's I think it's a good question. I think there's a lot of concern about having the executive branch having too much influence over commercial policy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah, that's why we have an FCC. So
that's
that
why we have an independent agency. That's why we
yeah,
run around
yeah.
the world telling people, don't let politics interfere with your telecom policy. I realize that's a little funny, but
Yeah.
you really do want a free market to the largest extent possible.
Right.
So I think the way it is probably the way that it needs to be, but with better guardrails. And I think the FCC and NTIA made a lot of headway with that. I think the White
Hmm.
House needs to really fully support NTIA's role, because I don't think the issue is FCC. I think people realize the FCC is the final arbiter, but it's on the
Hmm.
federal side where there's too many opportunities to find another parent to go to try to seek a change.
Hmm.
And that's where NTIA needs to be bolstered and supported by the White House. The Secretary of Commerce has been great, but it always needs to be also the Secretary of Commerce and the White House.
Well, and probably the missions of the FCC and NTIA are fairly distinct. Maybe the most overlap would be on the research side. And it's one of the underappreciated assets of NTIA that's gotten a lot of attention over just in the last several months is ITS. And they're sort
Absolutely.
of Yeah, they're sort of my local neighborhood, radio research organization because they're about 20 minutes away from where I live. So I know who they are. Go to ISART and all that. But
Yes, good. ISART's terrific. I mean, I don't think people understand, when they talk about the Office of Spectrum Management, the Office of Spectrum Management uses ITS as its modeling arm. When it needs to determine what are going to be the effects of some of the policies, ITS is the one that tests them out and comes up with the research and the applied science around that. I'm not an engineer, so forgive me for my terminology. And then other agencies go to ITS as well. DoD uses ITS for its 5G test beds. Commercial entities use ITS when they have some kind of interference problem and they want to do some real life modeling and testing. So you're absolutely right. ITS is underappreciated, severely underfunded. So I definitely encourage industry to look to ITS to the extent that they are looking to coordinate with federal agencies, to use them as kind of it's a neutral arbiter. I mean, they're there for the science. They're not there for any political outcome. And it can really help bring together the stakeholders in terms of understanding the interference potential of a particular proposal.
Yeah, they did an ISART conference a few years ago that was all about how to model propagation of 5G, and that's a super critical, very important question that impacts everything from where you place small cell antennas to how you deal with interference, and how do you model the deployment of really any kind of a 5G network. But nobody else is doing that.
And they also they participate in standards bodies.
Mm-hmm.
They're very active to the extent that they can be.
By the way, I did a podcast with Keith Grimbond about that very, very ISART meeting. That I'll put it in the blog post. I'll put the number of that so people. Yeah, we ended up talking about how you find Mayan temples from the air, because it turns out LiDAR,
yes,
which is developed for like safety and communications. It's actually a good way to get through, to penetrate through like jungle overgrowth. And in southern Mexico and Central America, there's a lot of abandoned Mayan architecture that's just been swallowed up literally by the jungle. And explorers might be out there and there's a temple like 20 feet away and you just can't see it because the overgrowth is so thick. But yeah, with LiDAR, that is pretty cool stuff. Anyway, what advice do you have for those of us who are following in your footsteps and doing spectrum policy now after you retire and sail off into the sunset and have drinks with little umbrellas on them and whatever you're going to do?
Well, like I said, if you have a chance to serve in government, do it. If you have a chance to serve at both the FCC and NTIA, do it. Try it. NTIA actually is very good about posting a lot of its documents. It doesn't tout them a lot, but if you read them, you learn a lot. Understanding the Red Book, and a lot of their spectrum documents, and you just go on the website. It's all there. Can really give you a good picture of how they go about planning spectrum, identifying spectrum, working with the agencies and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that's classified that you're never going to get your hands on, but there's still enough there that you can really educate yourself. And if you're an engineer, go to the ISART conference. It's such a great conference and it's practically free. It was free this year because it was completely virtual. The only thing you pay for is your food when you go in person. So absolutely go to the ISART conference.
Yeah, they have done some. They do a few little smaller conferences that are more focused. Like I think they've done a couple on FirstNet and
Hmm.
yeah, it's just yeah, it's a good idea to keep close watch on ITS. They're a underappreciated resource. Well, great. Yeah, yeah, I enjoyed the talk. I think it kind of strikes that balance between being entertaining and informative, and yeah, we that's what we strive for here. Because I
That's
mean,
right.
after all, aren't we in the entertainment business? No, not really. And folks, we've been talking to Anna Gomez, who is as you know, if you listen to the to much of the recording, she's retiring after a great career in spectrum policy in both the public and private sector. And Anna, I think then I'm gonna have to get somebody from ITS in an upcoming podcast to sort of go over some of these some of these things that came up in the last 10 minutes or so of the recording. Because yeah, it's one thing to tell people to go do something, and it's a whole lot better to kind of show them the way. And I think you're going to help us do that. So once again, thanks for appearing. This is the High Tech Forum podcast. We do these on a fairly infrequent basis, but you know what to do if you just saw a podcast that you liked, and so go do that. And Richard Bennett signing off.